All right. Hello again, Avengers, and welcome to another exciting daily vlog. This is daily vlog number. Let's actually look. I have no idea anymore. What I used to do is I would look at the dates and I would know how many days ahead of the date I was. And I just stopped doing that when the numbers became too complicated to add in my head. So this is daily vlog number 326. So today, obviously I have internet again, which is nice. I mentioned in my phone vlog yesterday. I've read through the Illrigger, cool class. Going to do an in-depth review on it. Read through the new Power Rangers SS20s book, Through the Shattered Grid, I think is what it's called. Cool books, cool book. Have lots of opinions. Going to do an in-depth review on it. I've now finished the Dungeon Master's Guide. Cool book. Have lots of opinions on it. And then I very, very quickly perused both the new Factions in Action Volume 2 for the G.I. Joe RPG and the book that I've been meaning to do an in-depth review since like April, which is the Gadget Guide or whatever it's called. I've perused them. Thank you, computer. That's what I wanted. If anyone wants to know what that strange sound was, I just got informed that if I don't log in to Star Wars The Old Republic, they're going to give my character names away. So I was just downloading that in the background. So looking it over, I started doing the prep work for my in-depth review of the Illrigger because with it being the smallest of the books that I'm going to do an in-depth review on, theoretically should be the fastest. And I was looking it over and I was trying to figure out exactly the things that I wanted to say about it, and it got me to thinking because I've mentioned in a previous post the idea of one of the reasons why D&D 5th edition does not have a bajillion different classes. They've officially only added one class in the 10 years that D&D 5th edition has been a thing. They have added one class. That's it. Matt Mercer introduced another one that became official due to just licensing and stuff like that. And then the Illrigger, which is Matt Colville's new-ish class. Technically, the Illrigger has been around for a while. This is just a revised version of it. And I mentioned before, the reason that we don't have a bajillion different Giga classes is straight up because the design ideas behind 5th edition strongly discourage creating a bunch of different classes. The reason why is every class is designed to play very, very differently right from the beginning. And so if you have an idea for a new class, because you're like, oh, you know what? I want to create a sword mage class. For anyone who doesn't know, there was a class in 4th edition I really, really loved. It was one of the first classes I ever played. And I've recreated that character many, many times. Sword Mage is a really cool defender class from 4th edition. And technically, there isn't a 5th edition version of it. There is, but there isn't. Because the main mechanic around the Sword Mage was this marking this marking feature that was built into defender classes for 4th edition, and the unique ways that the Sword Mage interacted with that feature. Basically, the way the Sword Mage worked was every defender had the ability to mark creatures. And what marking did, as its most basic form, was when you mark a creature, it would get a -2 to attack rolls against anything other than you. And the role-playing kind of definition of it was basically you would do something to them that would make them want to focus on you personally. And as a mechanic, it's one that I really, really enjoyed because it allowed someone to play a character whose job it was to protect their allies. And one of the ways to protect your allies was to take attacks for them. There isn't a marking mechanic in 5th edition. There's a few spells and abilities that effectively do a very similar thing. Things like Compelled Duel effectively does this as the same thing, but it's a spell and it's not built into a class or anything like that. So if I wanted to make a Sword Mage class for D&D 5th edition, I theoretically could try doing that. However, the class design philosophy behind 5th edition basically means if you cannot create a wholly unique mechanic, then don't create a wholly unique class. Create a subclass for one of the existing classes. Because if you're creating a new class, it needs to play completely differently than everything else that currently exists. We don't want, well, it's a fighter, but he can kind of use magic. We already have that. We have the Eldritch Knight. We also have the Blade Singer for the Wizard. We have the Hexblade for the Warlock. There's a bunch of different ways to create a character that uses weapons and combines it with magic. They even have kind of a shorthand for classes similar to that, and they call it a third caster. And the reason they call it that is when you are multi-classing, to figure out how many spell slots you should have available to you, what you do is you add up all of your classes that can cast spells. And depending on the class, they have different values. If you are what's called a full caster, like a wizard or a sorcerer, you just add the full level. If you are what's called a half caster, something like a paladin or a ranger that only gets up to level 5, they call that a half caster because you only add half of their levels to figure out what your total spell slot should be. If you're a fighter with like an Eldritch Knight subclass where their max spell level only goes up to level 4, that's considered a third caster, a 1/3 caster. Because when you're adding levels of that class into your total to figure out how many spell slots you should have, you only add a third of that. And it's basically, full casters are, excuse me for a second. Full casters are exactly that. They get all the way up to 9th level spells, and they're kind of designed around the idea that you're going to be casting spells as your main action most turn. Half casters are exactly that. They're designed to combine sword play or martial attacks with spells as well. So you're going to be going kind of half and half. Sometimes you're going to be using martial abilities. Sometimes you're going to be casting spells. And it's about half and half. Third casters are a martial class that's primarily designed around being a martial class, but they give it that little splash of magic. So you're not going to be casting spells every turn. You're not going to be casting spells every other turn, but probably every like 3-ish turns, you're going to be using some sort of spell. And a lot of times with third casters, the higher you go, they will start adding things in that allow you to mix in a little bit of spell casting with your regular combat. So you can do things like take the attack action, but still cast a cantrip as one of your attacks and things like that. So it got me to thinking, after going over the Illrigger, it got me to thinking, with how many different subclasses exist and how many different classes currently exist in 5th edition. I'm talking specifically about officially published classes plus the 2 third-party classes that are acknowledged by D&D Beyond. What kind of mechanics still don't exist in D&D 5th edition that you could build an entire class around? And obviously, I have 2 classes I created myself. They're in the DM's Guild. If you want to find them, one of them is called the Dragon Knight class. The Dragon Knight class. There's another person that put on a Dragon Knight class there, and it's just called Dragon Knight class. It's not as good as mine. I'm just going to put it out there. It's not as good as mine. And then I also have the Blood Knight class. So if you go to the DM's Guild and type in the Dragon Knight class to the search bar, the first thing that'll come up should be my class. It's a platinum bestseller. And if you go to the DM's Guild, I think you only need to type in Blood Knight, because I think I'm the only person with a Blood Knight class. But you can find my classes there. They have completely unique mechanics. The Dragon Knight class is built around technically 2 unique mechanics. One, every one of the classes and subclasses, I think there's a grand total of 5 subclasses I have for the Dragon Knight class now. Every class and subclass has a unique weapon that they can transform regular 5th edition weapons into these unique weapons. So that's one of the unique mechanics. The other mechanic is the dragon transformation. Each subclass has, or actually just the class in and of itself, has a kind of powered up form that they can enter for a limited amount of time. And so those 2 things combine to create unique mechanics. The stuff that my Dragon Knight can do, you can't do with any other class. It is designed to be wholly unique, and I think it's a pretty fun class to play in general. The other thing that makes that class unique is what are called dragon attacks, which kind of goes along with the dragon transformation, but they're basically special abilities that each of the subclasses gets that allows them to do kind of extraordinary things, which again, you can't replicate in D&D 5th edition with just multi-classing or something like that. So a character built around a kind of powered up form mechanic doesn't really exist. Are there classes that have like a powered up form? Absolutely. The druid, a couple different flavors of the druid allows you to sacrifice some of their wild shape charges to get into like a powered up form. The one that I'm most familiar with, the Druid of the Stars, has kind of a powered up form. But the Druid itself is not built around that powered up form, and even our Circle of Stars Druid, yes, that is a major mechanic of it, but the powered up forms in and of themselves are not that different, to be blunt. And they're not that, I mean, it's, you get a lot more variety from standard Druid wild shapes than you get from the Circle of Stars, as far as just different abilities that you can do and making the class play significantly different. Not saying Circle of Stars is a bad subclass. It's a really cool subclass, and I like it. It's just the idea of a class that's built around this kind of powered up form. You can't really replicate that with the Druid. And then Paladins in general, most of them get like a powered up form as either their penultimate or ultimate subclass ability. But again, the class isn't built around that. Those are one and done abilities that you only get when you're like 19th or 20th level. So that's how I kind of justify the idea of the Dragon Knight class can exist as its own unique class, because the mechanics in and of themselves are unique. Dragon Knight plays very differently from every other character. Same thing is true about the Blood Knight. The Blood Knight, the main mechanic of it is it has a limited resource that it gains through making attacks. When you make an attack against someone, you gain a limited resource that you can then use a bonus action to burn to get something useful out of that. And so again, there's no class in the game that is built around the idea of I get more powerful the more times I make attacks. So those two are very unique mechanics. And there's more to the Blood Knight than just I get more stuff as I make attacks. But that's the big thing that makes it a unique class. So other than those two classes that I've designed, I've been trying to figure out, are there mechanics that currently don't exist or are not utilized very well in D&D 5th edition that would justify creating an entirely new class? And most of this is just based on, can I do something in either a previous version of D&D or in a different TTRPG entirely that I can't do in 5th edition using a combination of class, subclass, and feats? Thank you, Phone. And so I've been thinking really hard about this idea, and I kind of come to just a couple characters that I've wanted to create, and I just simply can't in a D&D game. The first, we've talked about it before, the idea of a shield throwing character, or more specifically, a character that specializes in throwing weapons in general. Now, I mentioned before, I created a throwing weapon-based character who used cards as a weapon for flavor. So yes, there is the throwing weapons combat style that makes it easier for you to do that. But the number of throwing-based weapons is really, really limited. You basically have darts, and then various weapons with the melee weapons that have the thrown property, and that's it. So like daggers, light hammers, and spears. Those are really, and javelins. Those are really the only throwing-based weapons that are in the game, and the majority of them are melee weapons that you can also throw. There's only one throwing weapon that the only thing you do with it is throw it, and that's the darts. And darts in and of themselves are not great weapons. Because my throwing cards were reflavored darts, and that's how I was able to justify using them the way that I did. So, a throwing weapon-based character, while yes, you can make it, you have to really know the system really, really well to make a viable version of it, where they exclusively use the throwing-based weapons and actually can do interesting things. And like I said, the only way I was ever able to make that was using a Battlemaster fighter. If you want to get tricky, there's an Artificer infusion that allows you to turn any weapon into a returning weapon, and that kind of helps. But again, it's mostly designed around being able to like throw javelins all the time or throw light hammers all the time. It's not really designed to be like a knife wielding character that can just keep throwing knives and stuff like that. So I think in D&D 5th edition, if you wanted to create a throwing weapon based character where the character design itself was entirely based around throwing weapons, objects, whatever. I think there's enough of a gap in D&D 5th edition that you might be able to come up with some unique mechanics entirely around the idea of throwing weapons. So that's one thing that I think could possibly exist in 5th edition that I don't think exists right now and could become a very interesting class. It would require a lot of design work. Because again, there are throwing weapons already in D&D, and there are ways to create throwing weapon-based characters. They're extremely limited, but if you want something that is truly unique, which is how class design in 5th edition works, I think it'd be possible to create, I don't know what you could call it, but a character whose main focus is around throwing weapons. Very similar to, I made mention of it before when I was talking about shield throwing characters. In 4th edition, there's a character, I think they're called the Sentinel. That while they're not exclusively throwing weapon-based characters, they have an inherent trait where every time you throw a weapon, whether it hits or misses, it always comes back to you. So they're a range-based character. I believe they're technically a flavor of ranger. They're either a ranger or a druid. But they are, you are heavily incentivized to use thrown-based weapons. Because it allows you to do a lot more things. Do you have to? Absolutely not. You can be a bow-based sentinel. And I think the artwork for it uses a bow. But being a throwing weapon-based character in 4th edition is relatively difficult unless you are a sentinel where it excels. So I think taking the sentinel class and updating it to 5th edition could create an interesting throwing weapon-based character that, again, would play differently than everything else. As far as other classes that are other mechanics that don't particularly exist, another one of my favorite characters or classes from 4th edition is the Warlord. I've talked about this many, many times. It was a leader character, so it was a healer, basically. And basically what they did is they stood back from combat, and they would issue orders. And those orders could either buff their allies, they could give out free actions to their allies and stuff like that. And again, the Battlemaster Fighter does allow you to do that to a point. There are 2 different maneuvers that kind of mimic that. One maneuver that allows you to do a kind of a simple heal, and another maneuver that allows you to give an action to an ally and they use their reaction to do it. However, the Battlemaster class is not built around the idea of you are a warlord. You are a battlefield commander that is issuing orders and kind of staying in the back line to be a purely support class. So I think mechanics-wise, I think you could create a warlord-style character or a battle commander-style character in 5th edition D&D, and it would play very, very differently from anything else currently on the market. And I think it would be a massively fun character to play. And then the last one I'm going to mention in this vlog, the Mystic was a class that they tried to create for 5th edition D&D years ago. There was a playtest, like within the first couple years of D&D 5th edition being a thing, there was a playtest that came out that introduced the Artificer and the Mystic. And the Artificer was not great in its initial version, but it was playable. And they eventually were able to kind of refine it into the Artificer that we have today, which is a super fun class to play. But the Mystic was just flat out broken. And it was because they were trying to create a new type of magic system, quote unquote, in the idea of psionic powers. They eventually abandoned the Mystic and replaced it with a few psionic-based classes and a few psionic-based feats, so that you could have psionic powers in 5th edition, but they weren't their own system. They were a combination of spells and subclass abilities or feats. I think mechanically, the idea of the Mystic is still an interesting thing. Now, again, the reason that they didn't move forward on the Mystic is because it was going to take far too much work to balance it. But the idea of the Mystic is they would have these abilities and this pool of psionic power points, basically magic points from any other tabletop RPG. They wouldn't use spell slots. They would have a pool of points. And depending on how many points that they spent, they could kind of use these psionic abilities and buff them in certain ways by just adding more points to them. Now, we already do have a system where you can cast spells and then buff them by upcasting them. But it's an extremely limited system in 5th edition. And for the most part, the only thing that happens when you upcast a spell is either it does more damage or it affects more people. That's really all it is let's add extra damage or let's affect more people. That's it. That's all upcasting does. So a character that is built around the idea that I have this limited pool of points or something, that I learn these abilities and they have a base cost, but then each ability would have like a menu board or something that if I burnt additional points, I could add effects onto that ability. I think that could be a really, really interesting class. And it would play very, very different from any other class currently in the game. And whether you're... Because, I mean, technically you do have the sorcerer where they can kind of modify their spells on the fly with their meta magic. But again, meta magic in and of itself... Yeah, you can do things like you can change the damage type of this spell, or you can cast it faster, or you can make it more difficult to hit, or you can make one of your allies automatically save. It doesn't really change how the spell works. It just generally makes the spell slightly more effective in a certain way. More effective in the idea that it doesn't hurt your allies as much, more effective in the idea that it hits more often, more effective in the idea that you can cast it and do something else on your turn. But it really doesn't change how the spell works. Like, a fireball is never going to be a control-based spell, no matter what meta magic options you add to it. And so, I think the idea of a character that has spells, abilities, whatever you want to call them, that have a base cost, and then either they have like an overall menu board of different effects that they can add to any one of these base spells for a particular cost, could be interesting. It would be flirting a little bit with the sorcerer in that thing. So you would need to make sure that none of the kind of menu board of psionic upgrades were basically just different versions of meta magic options. But I think what would be even more interesting is that every ability, spell, power, whatever you want to call them, every one that you get has its own little menu board of anywhere between like probably say 4 to 6 different upcast things that you could add to it. Thank you for the phone. That you could add to it to kind of modify how this as a spell works. And then balancing things around that would be, okay, well, maybe at a certain level you can only add one upgrade to the base of ability, and then as you level up you can add 2 or 3. And maybe the ability to mix and match 2 different abilities, where you can take the upgrade abilities from a different power and use them on this one, or maybe having a mechanic where during your downtime, you can actually merge two powers into one. That allows you to basically kind of switch or pick the particular upgrades for that particular power and the particular base ability for it to create kind of a unique conglomeration. I think that could be a really, really interesting, fun class to play. And again, there's nothing in D&D 5th edition right now that would allow you to create a character like that in any way, shape, or form. Like, it's just not possible. And I think that is the most important part about class design currently in 5th edition, is the idea that it needs to be a wholly unique ability in general. Or it needs to have a wholly unique mechanic in general in order to be a new class. So, interested to hear from you guys, though. Are there classes from other tabletop RPGs or mechanics from other tabletop RPGs or video games, whatever, that you would love to be able to play in 5th edition, but there just simply isn't a class, subclass, feat combination that will allow you to mimic that in a tabletop RPG? Let me know, it's specifically in D&D 5th edition. Let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that's going to be all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.